Is there life after death? Surely there is no more important question than that. And yet it's a question that very few in this world ever stop to consider. Among men, there are generally two schools of thought regarding life and death. In the religious sphere, there are several variations to the immortal soul doctrine, which teaches that the dead are not dead, but living. Outside of religion, there is the idea that ignores God and assumes death ends all. In fact, both of these ideas are false. Both are inventions of human imagination. Neither of them are supported by any evidence, whether it be biblical revelation or scientific proof. They're just superstitious ideas invented by men. Furthermore, in 6,000 years of human history, no one yet has ever come back from the dead to tell us anything about the experience, except for one individual this world rejects by either denying his messiahship or by rejecting the message he brought from God. Thousands witnessed the last agony and death of Jesus Christ. At least 500 people saw him after his resurrection from the dead. But precious few have ever grasped what he taught about life and death. Isn't it about time we finally learned what man really is and what hope there is of life after death?
The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. Is the grave really the end? Or is man an immortal soul that lives on forever? Most theologians claim that death is merely the separation of body and soul. And where did they get this teaching about the immortality of the soul? Notice this revealing quote from the Jewish Encyclopedia. The belief that the soul continues its existence after the dissolution of the body is a matter of philosophical or theological speculation rather than of simple faith, and is accordingly nowhere expressly taught in the Holy Scripture. Well, if it didn't come from the Bible, where did it come from? Notice what Herodotus, the famous Greek historian who lived in the 5th century before Jesus, admitted. The Egyptians were also the first that asserted that the soul of man is immortal. This opinion, some among the Greeks, have at different periods of time adopted as their own. Among the Greek philosophers who embraced this pagan idea, Plato became the principal exponent of the immortal soul doctrine. One of his famous dialogues, called Phaedo, recounts the last conversation Socrates had with his friends on the day of his death. In the dialogue, Socrates is convinced that upon death his soul would go right on living. Socrates says, "Be of good cheer and do not lament my passing. When you lay me down in my grave, say that you are burying my body only and not my soul." Now, as I continue reading this quote, I want you to first think about when it was written, about 400 years before Christ, and then I want you to compare it with what you've probably heard coming out of Christian churches. Continuing, it says, "Do we believe there is such a thing as death? To be sure. And is this anything but the separation of the soul and body? And being dead is the attainment of this separation, when the soul exists in herself and separate from the body, and the body is parted from the soul. That is death. Death," it says, "is merely the separation of soul and body." Now, some of you have probably been taught that very same thing at church services. You've been led to believe that the immortality of the soul is a Christian doctrine that comes right out of the Bible, but it doesn't. It actually predates the Christian religion. This pagan idea came from Babylon and Egypt soon after the flood, and then spread around the earth thanks to the philosophies of Greek scholars. The introduction of this superstition into the traditional Christian churches happened gradually over the course of centuries. The early Catholic writers and teachers disagreed on this subject at first. Some of these men knew they did not have immortality within themselves, but other influential teachers like Augustine embraced the pagan idea and gave it the platform it needed to receive widespread acceptance. Finally, Thomas Aquinas, in the 13th century, stamped the doctrine of the immortality of the soul permanently on the Christian professing world, and those who rejected this idea were then branded as heretics. Just before the Protestant Reformation, the Lateran Council of 1513 issued this decree: whereas some have dared to assert concerning the nature of the reasonable soul that is mortal, we, with the approbation of the Sacred Council, do condemn and reprobate all those who assert that the intellectual soul is mortal, seeing according to the canon of Pope Clement V that the soul is immortal, and we decree that all who adhere to like erroneous assertions shall be shunned and punished as heretics. Those who taught something different than this false doctrine were actually turned over to the civil authorities for punishment. During the Reformation, some early Protestants tried to cast off the immortal soul doctrine. Martin Luther, for example, wrote in 1522, "It is probable, in my opinion, that with very few exceptions, indeed, the dead sleep in utter insensibility till the day of judgment. On what authority can be said that the souls of the dead may not sleep, in the same way that the living pass in profound slumber the interval between their downlying at night and their uprising in the morning?" It's the same as sleep, he brought out. Death, where you go to sleep and you know not anything, as it says over in the book of Ecclesiastes. Luther's original teachings have never ceased to embarrass Protestant theologians who have since readopted the teachings of ancient Egypt and Greece. Another reformer, William Tyndale, wrote this: "In putting departed souls in heaven, hell, or purgatory, you destroy the arguments wherewith Christ and Paul prove the resurrection. The true faith puts the resurrection. The heathen philosophers, denying that, did put that souls did ever live. If the soul be in heaven," he concludes, "tell me, what cause is there for the resurrection?" Now that's an excellent question. If man has an immortal soul, then why is there so much in the Bible about the resurrection from the dead? Let's look into the Bible with an open mind and find the conclusive answers we need to these all-important questions. Just what is man? And is there life after death? Let's begin in the book of Genesis. Genesis, as we've begun in this book with so many of our programs, and the reason we do is because this is the foundation for this present world that we live in, and so much is revealed in these first few chapters of the book of beginnings, the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 29. "And God said, Behold, I have given you every herb-bearing seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree, in the which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat." And verse 30 says, "And to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creeps upon the earth, wherein there is life, I have given every green herb for meat." And it was so. Now you can see there in verse 30, if you have a King James version of the Bible and a wide margin version, you can see there that that word life in verse 30 is actually translated as living soul in the margin. Living soul. Every living soul that God created for man, as that verse brings out, referring obviously to the other creatures that God made to sustain man who needed food and such to eat. Now look at chapter 2 and keep in mind that Hebrew word for living soul, as we'll look at in just a second. Verse 7, "And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. There you see it again. Now, only this time referring to man. He was made right out of the dust of the ground, and he became a living soul. The Hebrew word there for living soul is nephesh. Nephesh, which just means a living, breathing creature. God gave life to that creation by breathing into his nostrils, the breath of life. Animals, though, are creatures too, living souls as well. Nephesh is also used in Genesis 1 when referring to the other creatures that God made. Genesis 3 now, just hit a few high spots here. In verse 19 it says, "In the sweat of your face shall you eat bread till you return unto the ground, for out of it were you taken, for dust you are, and unto dust shall you return." We came from the dust of the ground. We are matter, or flesh, as Jesus said in John chapter 3. Whatever is flesh is flesh. Whatever's born of flesh, Jesus said, is flesh. And that flesh came out of the ground. We're made up of the matter that comes right out of the ground. Man is flesh, not spirit. Jesus revealed. The book of Genesis here reveals. Man is not a spiritual entity. Now there is a spiritual component that empowers us with the ability to think. And we'll look at that in just a second. But just to establish this from the outset here, man is not a spiritual entity, but a fleshly being, pure and simple. That's what the Bible reveals. For you, the man, God says, were made out of dust, and when we die, we return back to the dust. The soul that sins, it shall die, Ezekiel 18:4 says. And it returns right into the dust, as the book of Ecclesiastes brings out as well. But let's look at Genesis 7, a few pages ahead. Genesis 7, verse 21. It says, "And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and of cattle, and of beast, and of every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth, and every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of life," there's that phrase that we mentioned a moment ago, "and all that was in the dry land died." See, all of them had the same breath of life, whether human beings or animals, and any of them that had that breath, that life in that sense, that temporary existence, they were extinguished because of the rising floodwaters. All the flesh, whether man or animal, returns right back to the dust once that breath is taken away. And you can see that just when people or animals are buried and they decompose and they return back to dust, where we came from to begin with. Now look at Ecclesiastes 9 and verse 5 on your own time and see how that, as Solomon wrote over there, the dead know nothing. The dead know nothing. When they're dead, they're dead. When they die, they go into the ground and they decompose. Look at Psalm 146 and verse 4 on your own time as well. I'll just quote it to you. "His breath goes forth, he returns to this earth. In that very day his thoughts perish." See, when we return to this earth at death, then our thoughts perish, and we don't know anything, and we won't live again were it not for a resurrection from the dead, which the Bible refers to in so many passages, we couldn't count them all. And as Tyndale brought out in that quote I read at the start, to accept the immortal soul lie is to basically push aside the teaching, the plain teaching about a resurrection from the dead, which Jesus taught, which Paul taught, which David taught, which the Bible teaches.